Does your job leave you with constant headaches? When the pressure piles up, do you fight through it, or is it time to let go? Let's find out. The Unexpected Mentor Part 1. Carlos, a fresh-faced young man in his mid-20s, had just landed his first corporate job. He was excited and nervous at the same time. The idea of working in a large company thrilled him, but the daily pressure to perform and meet deadlines quickly began to wear him down. Every day, he would arrive early, work late into the night, and still feel like he wasn't making any real progress. His to-do list seemed to grow longer, not shorter. One evening after a particularly stressful day, Carlos found himself sitting alone in the office break room. His head was in his hands, and he felt completely overwhelmed. That's when he heard a voice. "Rough day, huh?" Carlos looked up to see Mr. Johnny, a senior employee who had been with the company for over 30 years. He was well known for his calm demeanor and wise words, though he didn't often socialize with the younger employees. Carlos nodded, too tired to say much. Mr. Johnny took a seat next to him. "I've been where you are. You know," he said kindly. "Back when I started, I thought the only way to succeed was to work harder, faster, and longer than everyone else. But that's not always the answer." "Curious," Carlos asked. "What is the answer then?" Mr. Johnny smiled as if he had been waiting for Carlos to ask that question. "It's about working smarter, not harder. It's about understanding what's really important and focusing on that. You can't do everything, Carlos. No one can. But you can do the right things, and that will make all the difference." Carlos listened intently, eager to learn more. He had always admired Mr. Johnny from a distance, but now hearing him speak directly, it felt like a lifeline. "Come by my office tomorrow," Mr. Johnny said as he stood to leave. "I'll show you a few tricks that have helped me over the years. You don't have to figure it all out alone." Carlos thanked him and felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. The next day, Carlos went to Mr. Johnny's office as promised. It was a simple room, not filled with fancy gadgets or impressive awards, but it radiated a sense of calm. Mr. Johnny welcomed him in and handed him a notebook. "Before we start," Mr. Johnny said, "I want you to write down all the things you think you need to do this week." Carlos, slightly confused, began writing. It was a long list: emails, reports, meetings, presentations, catching up on old tasks. Everything came flooding out onto the paper. When he finished, the page was almost completely filled. Mr. Johnny looked at the list, then handed Carlos a highlighter. "Now, highlight the things that absolutely have to be done. What's urgent? What will move the needle?" Carlos hesitated but started marking the tasks. When he finished, he was surprised to see that only a handful of items were highlighted. "See that?" Mr. Johnny pointed out. "Not everything is urgent. Not everything is important. You need to learn how to prioritize. Focus on what matters most and let the rest follow. You'll find that your productivity will improve, and so will your peace of mind." Carlos stared at the page. It was so simple, yet so powerful. "How do you manage to stay so calm?" he asked. Mr. Johnny chuckled. "Well, after 3 decades in this business, you learn a few things, but it all boils down to balance. Work is important, yes, but so is your health, your family, and your happiness. If you burn yourself out, you won't be good to anyone. Not your company, not your loved ones, and certainly not yourself." For the next few weeks, Carlos put Mr. Johnny's advice into practice. He started focusing on the most important tasks and learned to let go of the smaller, less urgent matters. To his surprise, his stress levels began to drop. He wasn't working any less, but he was working smarter. He felt more in control, more balanced. As Carlos's confidence grew, so did his responsibilities. The management team began to notice his improvement, and soon he was offered a promotion. Carlos was thrilled. He felt like he had finally cracked the code to succeeding in the corporate world. But Carlos never forgot the lessons Mr. Johnny had taught him. He knew that the key to his success wasn't just hard work, it was the wisdom he had been given. And now it was his turn to pass that wisdom on. One day, Carlos noticed a new employee, Sarah, who looked just as overwhelmed as he had been when he first started. Her desk was cluttered with papers, and she seemed to be frantically trying to keep up with her tasks. Carlos approached her, remembering how lost he had once felt. "Need a hand?" he asked. Sarah looked up, relief in her eyes. "I'm drowning," she admitted. Carlos smiled gently. "I've been there. Let me show you something that helped me." He guided her through the same process Mr. Johnny had shown, him helping her prioritize her tasks and manage her workload. As they worked together, Carlos felt a deep sense of fulfillment. It wasn't just about climbing the corporate ladder anymore. It was about helping others, just as Mr. Johnny had helped him. Years passed, and Carlos continued to grow in his career. He rose through the ranks to become one of the company's senior leaders. He was respected not just for his work ethic, but for his ability to remain calm under pressure, his efficiency, and his willingness to lend a helping hand. But no matter how successful he became, Carlos never forgot his roots. He remembered those early days when he had been overwhelmed and stressed, unsure of how to succeed. And he never forgot Mr. Johnny, the man who had given him the advice that had changed everything. One afternoon, as Carlos sat in his office reviewing reports, he thought about Mr. Johnny. He hadn't seen him in years. After retiring, Mr. Johnny had moved to a quiet town a few hours away. Carlos had always meant to visit, but life had gotten in the way. Now, sitting in his office, Carlos realized it was time to change that. He owed Mr. Johnny a visit. After all, he had so much to thank him for. Mr. Johnny's wisdom hadn't just changed Carlos's life. It had rippled out, helping countless others along the way. The following weekend, Carlos made the drive to the small town where Mr. Johnny now lived. It was a peaceful place, far removed from the fast pace of the city. Carlos parked his car and walked up to the modest house. As he knocked on the door, he felt a wave of nostalgia. When Mr. Johnny opened the door, his face lit up with a warm smile. "Carlos," he exclaimed, "it's been too long." Carlos grinned as they embraced. "I've been meaning to come visit," he said. "Life just got so busy." They sat down in Mr. Johnny's cozy living room, and for the next few hours they talked about everything. Carlos shared stories of his career and how he had passed on the wisdom Mr. Johnny had given him. Mr. Johnny listened with a proud smile on his face. "You've come a long way," Mr. Johnny said. "I always knew you had it in you." Carlos nodded. "I couldn't have done it without you. Your advice changed everything for me, and it's helped so many others too. You've created a ripple effect, Mr. Johnny." Mr. Johnny leaned back in his chair, his eyes twinkling. "That's the goal, Carlos. Helping others, passing on what you've learned. That's what it's all about. That's the real legacy." As Carlos drove home that evening, he thought about his journey. From a young, inexperienced employee struggling to keep up with the demands of the corporate world, to a seasoned leader who had found success through balance and wisdom. He realized that the most valuable lessons he had learned weren't about how to climb the corporate ladder or outwork his colleagues. The true lessons were about balance, knowing when to push himself and when to step back, understanding the importance of working smart, and most of all, helping others along the way. Carlos had mentored many employees over the years, and he could see the positive impact it had on their careers and lives. He understood that success wasn't just about personal achievements. It was about lifting others as you rise. As he pulled into his driveway, Carlos felt at peace. His career had been fulfilling, but what mattered most was the difference he had made in the lives of others. That was the real measure of success. And as he sat there reflecting on his journey, Carlos knew that Mr. Johnny's wisdom would continue to live on, not just through him, but through all the people he had helped, and through all the people they would help in turn. The legacy of wisdom and mentorship would continue for generations to come. As Carlos settled into his home that evening, the feeling of contentment stayed with him. He had learned so much from his experiences, and the gratitude he felt toward Mr. Johnny seemed to grow stronger as the years passed. But deep down, Carlos knew that life had more to offer, and his journey wasn't over yet. He had built a successful career and mentored many, but there was always more room for growth and understanding. The next day at work, Carlos found himself staring at the stack of files on his desk. Even though he was now a senior leader, the workload never seemed to let up. But this time, instead of feeling overwhelmed, he simply smiled. He had learned to manage his tasks, prioritize, and keep a clear mind. The lessons from Mr. Johnny had made all the difference. That afternoon, his phone buzzed with a message from his assistant. "There's a new employee in the office. She's fresh out of university and seems a bit lost. Thought you might want to say hello." Carlos stood up and stretched. He knew what that message really meant. Someone needed guidance. Someone needed help. And he was ready for it. He walked over to the new employee's desk and saw a young woman nervously typing away at her computer. She looked up startled when she saw Carlos approaching. "Hi, I'm Carlos," he said, extending his hand. "Welcome to the team." The young woman shook his hand, her nerves visible. "I'm Emma," she replied, her voice quiet. "Thank you." Carlos noticed the scattered papers on her desk, the same overwhelmed look that he had once worn on his face. "It looks like you've got a lot on your plate," he said gently. Emma nodded. "I just started last week, and I'm trying to keep up, but it's a lot." Carlos smiled. "I know the feeling. It can be overwhelming at first, but you don't have to do it all alone. How about we grab a coffee, and I can share a few tips that helped me when I started?" Emma's eyes brightened. "That would be great, thank you." Over coffee, Carlos shared the story of his early days in the company, the long hours, the stress, and the confusion about how to manage it all. He told Emma about Mr. Johnny and the life-changing advice that had reshaped his approach to work. "I used to think that working longer hours meant being more productive," Carlos explained, "but Mr. Johnny taught me that it's about working smarter, not harder. It's about prioritizing the things that matter most and knowing when to take a break." Emma listened intently, nodding as Carlos spoke. "I've been trying to do everything at once," she admitted. "I'm afraid of falling behind, and I feel like if I stop, I'll never catch up." Carlos leaned back in his chair, remembering those exact feelings. "I used to feel the same way," he said, "but trust me, it's not about doing everything. It's about focusing on the right things. If you take care of yourself and stay balanced, you'll actually be more productive." For the first time, Emma looked like she could breathe a little easier. "I'll give it a try," she said. "Thank you so much for your advice." Carlos smiled warmly. "You're going to do great. And if you ever need more help, just ask. We're all in this together." As the weeks went by, Carlos continued to check in on Emma, offering guidance and support whenever she needed it. He watched her grow more confident, her work improving, and her stress levels decreasing. It reminded him so much of his own journey, and he felt a deep sense of pride watching her flourish. One day after a successful presentation, Emma approached Carlos with a smile. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "Your advice really changed the way I approach my work. I'm not as stressed anymore, and I feel like I can handle things better. I couldn't have done it without your help." Carlos felt a familiar warmth in his chest. "You did the hard work," he replied. "I just gave you a little push in the right direction." Emma shook her head, her expression serious. "No, really. You've been such a big help. I hope one day I can pass on this advice to someone else." Carlos's heart swelled with pride. "That's the goal," he said softly. "That's how we all grow, by passing it on." As Emma walked away, Carlos felt the full weight of those words. He had become the mentor now, just as Mr. Johnny had been for him. The wisdom he had gained was being passed on, creating a ripple effect that would continue to grow and spread. It was a powerful reminder that the true measure of success wasn't just about personal achievements. It was about the impact you have on others. As time went on, Carlos continued to lead, mentor, and grow in his career. But despite his success, he never forgot Mr. Johnny and the impact that one man had made on his life. He often thought about visiting him again, to catch up and to thank him once more for the wisdom he had passed on. One rainy evening, Carlos found himself sitting in his office, thinking about how quickly time had passed. It had been years since his last visit to Mr. Johnny. As he stared out the window, watching the rain fall, he made a decision. It was time to reconnect. The following weekend, Carlos made the drive to the small town where Mr. Johnny now lived. The countryside was peaceful, a stark contrast to the bustling city life Carlos had grown accustomed to. As he pulled up to the familiar house, he felt a wave of nostalgia wash over him. When Mr. Johnny opened the door, his face lit up with a wide smile. "Carlos," he exclaimed, his voice full of warmth. "It's been too long." Carlos returned the smile. "It has," he agreed. "I've been meaning to visit for a while." They spent the afternoon catching up, talking about life, work, and everything in between. Carlos shared stories of his career, the people he had mentored, and the lessons he had passed on. Mr. Johnny listened, his eyes twinkling with pride. "You've done well, Carlos," Mr. Johnny said. "I always knew you had it in you." Carlos smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "Your advice changed everything for me, and now it's helping others too. You've created a legacy." Mr. Johnny leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "That's the goal, isn't it? To pass on what we've learned, to help others grow. That's the real measure of success." As Carlos drove home that evening, he reflected on his journey. From a young, overwhelmed employee struggling to find his footing to a seasoned leader who had found balance, success, and fulfillment. He had learned so much along the way, and the most important lessons weren't about climbing the corporate ladder. They were about balance, wisdom, and helping others. Carlos thought about all the people he had mentored, the lives he had touched, and the impact he had made. He realized that success wasn't just about personal achievement. It was about creating a positive impact on the people around you. Mr. Johnny's wisdom had set off a chain reaction, a ripple effect that would continue for generations. As he pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine, Carlos felt a deep sense of peace. His career had been fulfilling, but more than that, it had been meaningful. He had made a difference, and that was what mattered most. Carlos knew that the greatest legacy he could leave behind wasn't his own accomplishments, but the wisdom he had shared, the wisdom that had been passed down to him from Mr. Johnny, and that he would continue to pass on to others for years to come. And as he sat there reflecting on everything he had learned, Carlos realized that his journey was far from over. There would always be new challenges, new people to help, and new lessons to learn. But with each step forward, he would carry with him the wisdom that had shaped his life. Because in the end, the true measure of success wasn't about how high you climbed. It was about how many people you helped along the way. Carlos sat in his car for a while longer, lost in his thoughts. The journey he'd taken, the lessons he'd learned, and the people he'd met along the way, it all felt like a beautiful tapestry woven together. But even as he reflected, he knew there was still more to do, more people to help, and more wisdom to share. The next morning, as Carlos prepared for work, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His career had been fulfilling, but now it was clear that his true calling was in helping others find their way. He could see how his small acts of guidance had rippled through the lives of those he mentored, and that gave him great satisfaction. At the office, things were as busy as usual. Carlos's schedule was packed with meetings, presentations, and deadlines. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt focused and calm. He knew how to handle it all now, and more importantly, he knew how to help others handle it too. Later that afternoon, his assistant knocked on his door. "Carlos, there's someone here to see you." Part 1 of this story ends here. Who could be the person coming to meet Carlos? Did Carlos make a mistake? To find out, click the video here or follow the link in the description.